Some of you may be familiar with the sci-fi show Battlestar Galactica. Maybe it's because you remember the 1970s version, or like me, the more familiar with the new one. But in both cases, it's the story of, and they use this phrase, a ragtag fleet of refugees, the sole survivors of humanity, with only one warship to protect them as they wander the galaxy in search of a future home that they only hope is real. They don't know that, but the legends tell them that Earth is out there and they're searching for it. And of course, as many seasons as the show lasts, that's how long they're searching, because it kind of ends when they find it. It is science fiction, and the 70s version is pure cheese. I mean, holy cow, it's campy. But the idea of holding on to hope about a place where you can live in safety and freedom, that's a powerful idea. It has inspired countless peoples through the centuries, and sadly also been the impetus behind wars to either liberate or conquer what was believed to be our rightful land. Whether that claim was legitimate or not, many people have been inspired by the idea of a homeland, a place that belongs to us. We're going to take a look in Genesis chapter 12, 4-9, at how this idea relates to Abraham and his descendants. Beginning in verse 4, it says, "So Abram went as the Lord had told him." Because chapter 11, verses 31 and 32 had already detailed his father Terah's role in going about half of the way to Canaan with Abram, we kind of already knew that Abram's response to God's call was to go. Here the text tells us of his obedience with a matter of fact, "So Abram went." The primary question in Abram's decision is why? Why did he go? There really isn't much to it. He left his home to journey to a new land because he believed God. What Abram knew about God was enough to convince him that God is trustworthy. Now, we don't know the details of what exactly that was. What was it about God that Abram already knew, or what was it about his appearance and his message on this occasion that sold Abraham on the idea? But whatever that combination of experiences and beliefs was, it worked. Now, this is the first example, with many others to follow in the book of Genesis, of why Abram will one day be known as the man of faith. He believes and he acts upon that belief. We're also told that Lot went with him. Did Lot also go in faith or out of loyalty to his surrogate father, Abram? Remember, his dad died when he was young. So he's going to be an interesting person for us to track as the narrative of Genesis continues, because we're going to return to Lot on several occasions. And one of the reasons he's interesting is his words and his deeds will continue to leave us scratching our collective heads as to whether or not he really believes in God. What is it that Lot believes about God? He seems to be kind of along for the ride. It's hard to figure him out. So we'll keep an eye on him. For now, we just know he's with Abram. We're told Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. Questions about the numbers being symbolic in Genesis, we'll set those aside once again. The point here is that Abram is not a young man when he heard God's call and obeyed it. He was an established person in Ur. And then he reestablished himself somewhat in Haran until after his father's death. So now the journey that goes with those blessings and promises needs to be made. So he took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. God's command and promises came to Abram. But Sarai wasn't just along for the ride. She will be an active participant in this story, someone with agency. She will make impactful decisions. And she is someone whom God also expects to have faith along with her husband. So don't forget about her. The people in question here are servants. Others might choose to call them slaves. When we're talking about the Old Testament, definitions matter quite a bit because there were many degrees of servitude that existed in the ancient Near East. We don't know how many people that are being talked about here. How many people are we talking about? We know two of them by name because they will come into the story later. One is Eleazar and the other is Hagar. They will both have consequential roles in the years to come. For now, we're simply reminded that Abram's faith affected numerous other people. He had their lives, he had their well-being in his hands. His trust in God impacted their entire lives. His wife and Lot and all of these other people in his extended household, all depending on his faith being the correct thing. We're told Abram traveled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. The three locations mentioned here in verse 6 and then in a moment in verses 8 and 9, Shechem, Bethel, and the Negev, will be actually the same ones visited by Jacob 2 generations later. And the same places also that will be mentioned during Joshua's conquest of the land in the book of Joshua. As such, it seems that Moses wanted the Israelites to consider Abram's travels here to have symbolic value and to be something that is setting the stage for what his grandson and his later ancestors would do. These places are not chosen randomly. Shechem is in the hill country. It's west of the Jordan River, about a halfway between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea. It had, apparently, a noteworthy tree, perhaps because this tree was associated with the Canaanite pagan worship rituals of the kind that were very common in this era. We're not sure what it was about the tree, but even in Moses' day, the tree was famous enough to be mentioned. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Now, that's not really something that Moses' readers didn't know already, right? They knew that there were Canaanites in the land because there were Canaanites in the land right now. They're on their way from Egypt to Canaan, and the place is full of Canaanites. And those people have been here for as long as anyone knows. They've been here a long time. But it is here in the text to remind them and us that God's command to Abram sent him to a land that was already occupied. God didn't say to Abram, I'm going to send you to an island that is unoccupied, and you will be the first one there. He sent him to a land that had a lot of different tribes in it, actually. God promised to make Abram into a great nation, and he sent him to Canaan. Those two ideas seem to be in direct conflict. Something has to give. Abram can't become a great nation in this land that already has more than a half dozen tribes/nations in it. So either the reality of who is in this land now has got to change, or God's promise is not going to come true. Obviously, we have to hold this thought all the way to the day of Joshua to see how it is fulfilled. We're told that the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." And this is where we're going to spend the bulk of our time this morning. I've actually got 3 pages on just this sentence. These are words whose impact have been felt in our generation and on the news every week of this past year. I was born the year after the Yom Kippur War, when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise invasion on that holy day. A war that saw the superpowers, if you remember, on opposite sides, with the Soviets racing to get more tanks and ammunition to the Arab armies, and the United States racing to get more tanks and ammunition and planes to Israel. It was a tense moment. One of the half dozen or so times when World War III hung in the balance as a potential next step. In 1987, the first Intifada began, the uprising. A couple of thousand people died until the Oslo Accords were signed in 1993. The second Intifada began in the year 2000 and lasted until 2005, this one resulting in even more deaths. And then, of course, last October, Hamas invaded southern Israel, slaughtering civilians and taking back hostages, which sparked the war of reprisal that is still raging and threatening to engulf not only Gaza, but the West Bank and Lebanon and Syria. This land, known as the Promised Land, the Holy Land, Canaan, Judea, Israel, Palestine, among others, during its long history, has been at the crossroad of empires. It contains the site of the world's most contested field of battle at Megiddo, and I showed you those pictures after we got back from Israel of that valley, where dozens of battles have been fought all the way back to the Iron Age. It was even fought over by Christians and Muslims 1,000 years ago during the Crusades, although honestly both groups in that case were outsiders, claiming that the land belonged to them and their holy cause, when neither of them had a claim that these days we would feel has all that much legitimacy. One cannot talk for long or for very deeply about Abraham's descendants without referring to the land that they were in possession of for about 1,000 years from the days of Joshua, during which they were exiled for about 70 of those years. They returned, but with foreign empires like Persia and the Seleucids and the Romans in charge for most of the next 500 years. They rebelled against Rome, and that drove most of the Jewish population from the land into what's known as the diaspora, the dispersion, where for the next 1,800 years, the majority of Abraham's people lived outside of their ancestral land. And they remained a minority in that land until, horrifyingly, after the Holocaust, in 1948, the UN authorized a Jewish nation for the first time since before the birth of Christ. And 1948 began the path that led us to where we are in a state of war today. It is an understatement to say that the history of this land and its people is complicated, tragic, and connected to much evil that has wrongly been done in the name of the God of Abraham. While most evangelicals today are what we would call Zionists, in that they support the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish homeland located in the Holy Land, that's actually a very recent phenomenon and an abrupt change from a past where many in the church for centuries were actively anti-Semitic and didn't give a fig about whether the Jews had a homeland. So things have changed dramatically in this long, complicated history. This is, of course, not the only land in the world that has seen much blood in its history through war and rebellion. but the history of the Holy Land has been bloodier than most. And the conflict has lasted not just years or even generations, but millennia. What then can we say about this land? What can we learn from the perspective of Genesis, from the very beginning of this story that it has in human history? Remember, verse 6 just reminded us that the Canaanites were living in the land already when God gave it to Abram and his descendants. And this raises a key concept. I think this is a truth we can take from this story in Genesis and ponder to this day. Here it is. The whole earth belongs to God, because God is its creator, not to the people who inhabit it for 70. Here comes a pop culture reference, which I probably wouldn't know if I didn't have a 9-year-old daughter, but I do know this now. In Disney's Pocahontas, the title character sings a song with a famous line. It says, "You think you own whatever land you land on, that the earth is just a dead thing you can claim." And she goes on to say that they don't know what they're talking about. The song is written from a Native American religious viewpoint. It sees the earth as a sort of living thing whose ownership cannot be claimed by people. It's a fitting sentiment for Pocahontas to be sharing with these European colonists in the story, and it very nearly hits on the actual truth. The song is right, that people mistakenly believe that they have the power to claim land as their own, often through violent conquest or by displacing others. But it isn't a pantheistic earth that owns the land. Rather, it is Almighty God, the maker of heaven and earth, who alone can bestow the gift of a land to a people. And God alone who retains the right to revoke that gift and place the land in the hands of another people. Our folly as human beings is thinking that either we can appropriate that authority for our own use. In other words, we can say, yeah, God, we get what you're trying to do. We'll draw those lines for you. We'll move the people around because we see the plan. That's utter foolishness. Or, likewise foolish, we think we can claim that we're acting on God's behalf and with his support for our claim. It was such folly that led the Crusaders to shout, "God wills it," as they slaughtered the Jewish and Muslim inhabitants of Jerusalem when they captured it. So the first truth we can determine from the perspective of Genesis is that God, and God alone, has the authority to designate a land as belonging to a person or a people. God chose to give Canaan to Abram. It was God's purpose that this land would be inhabited by the descendants, by his descendants, and become the nation of Israel. It was also God's will that this designation would remain in force in the generations to come. We saw that in the psalm. It was also God's will, and even when God himself raised up King Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon to exile his people temporarily because they had broken the Mosaic covenant, God still ensured that in the next generation, the Persian Darius would allow them to return and once again reestablish Jerusalem and the temple. The morning Bible study group has been working through the minor prophets. We've been looking at that time in history. The promise from God to Abraham holds, even in the midst of the rising and falling of empires. Even when his chosen people fail to be what he has called them to be, God's purpose in allocating this land to Abraham's descendants remains firm and unchanging. To ponder this purpose as it unfolds in history, including the long sojourn in distant lands of the diaspora and the longing to return home of the modern Zionist movement, is a worthy effort as we attempt to understand the mind of God in the past. But the burning question now is, how does God's promise to Abram affect modern Israel? It's at this point, when we're trying to understand recent history, or even more of a challenge, current events, when we don't always even know what's really going on in the world, it's in this point that knowing the mind of God is the most difficult. Now, we have prayed each week during the service since last October the 7th and its horrors for peace in the Holy Land. You probably noted that my prayers as I lead this congregation have purposefully not been for specific solutions, but rather for God's will to be done with respect to justice and peace for all the people who call this ancient land home. What we need to do is avoid two extremes on this issue that fail to reflect God's promise or his nature. And these are the two things that we need to hold in tension and make sure we don't fail either one of them. Number one, we cannot accept the idea that Jews do not have a right in some way, shape, or form to live in the promised land. In this matter, the decisions of the United Nations, or the European Union, or the government of the United States, or the countries surrounding Israel are all secondary. None of them have the authority to revoke God's promise. The Jewish people have a rightful claim to this land. That's one idea. The second one, we cannot accept the idea that the land's other modern peoples, Palestinians, Arabs, Druze, Samaritans, Bedouins, many of them Muslims, a significant minority of them Christians, that they don't also have basic human rights and dignity as people equally created in the image of God. The history of the last few generations since 1948 has often brought those two ideas into conflict, with some claiming that the Jews don't have a right to this land, and we reject that. Others claiming that the other people living there don't have rights, and we reject that. The challenge is finding a way to keep both of these things without harming either. And of course, each of the wars that has taken place is an attempt to assert one or the other and deny both. And that's not acceptable. It's not easy to navigate the passions that this topic stirs up. But we have an obligation in this, as we do in all things, to seek to be Christ-like in our attitudes, thoughts, words, and deeds. When Nicole and I visited Israel in 2021, our guide was a Palestinian Christian, and he took pains to explain to us on several occasions, as the people in the tour asked questions when we visited this site or that. You could tell this was a very emotional topic for him, and he wanted us to understand. And from his perspective, Americans, Westerners, had an erroneous understanding of the land and its people in the modern era. Because he would point out to us and say, look, there is a synagogue, and on that next block is a mosque, and over there is a church. And in this community, all of those people are living in peace together. They're all just trying to pay the bills and raise their kids. None of them are trying to murder their neighbors, trying to expel them. And his view was that the vast majority of the people in the land are not hating each other. They just want to live. Of course, the events that took place 6 months later in October have put that theory, that view, to the test, have made it very difficult for many on both sides or on any side to see how peace coexistence can happen. And that, of course, is a massive cause for concern and sorrow here. Today, after nearly a year of violence and death, I hope he still is right about that. I hope that most of the people in this land would rather live in peace than harm people that aren't a part of their group. When peace finally comes, the hard work of rebuilding trust and community will remain. Let us finish our text this morning with a few other ideas. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. The there is Shechem. It's been a while since we heard where he was. Now that Abram is in the land God has promised to give him, he does something that would have been deeply symbolic in his culture. He builds an altar there dedicated to sacrifices to the Lord. It was an act of worship, but it was also like an explorer planting his nation's flag on a previously uncharted land. Abram is spiritually claiming this land for his God. Remember, there would have already been many altars in this land set up to worship many different Canaanite gods. Up until this point, however, there is no altar, no place of worship in this land to the God who had called Abraham and told him to come here. This is the first. Many generations later, when Joshua will lead the Israelites and their army and their people into this land, one of the things that God will tell them is a high priority is the destruction of all of these places of worship to the Canaanite gods, all of their altars, all of their sacred spaces. From there he went on toward the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. This second location is in the middle of the land. It's south of Shechem, but still north of what will become Jerusalem. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Abram repeats the process here once more with an altar that proclaims the Lord's claim to be the God of this land. Then Abram set out and continued toward the Negev. We end with Abram in the southern desert, having traversed the land from north to south and having proclaimed God's claim to it. He will now spend the rest of his days as a semi-nomadic herdsman in the hill country, moving from place to place, following the availability of water and grass, and living in a tent. Abram now lives in the land God has promised to him. That is a promise that God will fulfill once Abram's descendants have become a nation of 12 tribes, when God leads them into the land, having brought them out of slavery in Egypt with signs and wonders. For now, Abraham will live by faith that will one day come true. Three things that we can take from this text. Number one, Abram believed God, so he did what God told him to do. It's a pretty straightforward lesson. Number two, throughout the often difficult history of the Jewish people, God's promise that this land is their home has remained. And three, as we are called to do in all areas, we must endeavor to think, speak, and act with respect to the Holy Land and its people in a Christ-like manner. And let me say that well-meaning, God-honoring, faithful Christians do not have to have uniform opinions about every issue connected to the situation in the Holy Land. All right? I'm not going to tell you have to see everything the same way, because it is a very complicated situation. And as I told you, I think it was either on the prayer I did on Facebook after this happened in last October, or maybe it was in the Bible study that next week. At that point, the only thing left were bad choices. The only thing left from after that, October 7th, was death and destruction and how bad it was going to be. There were no good choices for the civilians. There were no good choices for the soldiers. There were no good choices for the government of Israel. So I wouldn't expect us all to see things exactly the same way. Why would we, when the situation is so difficult and so full of turmoil? But as I said, we need to hold those two ideas dear to our hearts, that the Jewish people have a right to this land, and that the other people living there have a right to human dignity too. And that is what we will continue to pray for.